22 Marines vanished in Vietnam jungle, August 1969. Military declared them all dead, body not recovered. Families grieved for 55 years. Then at 3:47 a.m. March 2024, my phone rang. My name is Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, service number 2237-8491. I was declared killed in action in 1969. But I'm not dead, and the story they told your families, every word of it was a lie. That phone call led me into the darkest military cover-up I've ever investigated, because Chen wasn't just alive, he'd been enslaved for 55 years, and he wasn't the only one. You see, I've spent the last 8 months verifying every detail of Chen's story. I've obtained classified documents that were never supposed to see daylight, interviewed Pentagon officials who demanded anonymity, and traveled to remote Vietnamese villages where the locals still whisper about the Americans who never left. What I discovered will shatter everything you think you know about missing soldiers, government accountability, and the true cost of war. Because the official story of Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon, wasn't just incomplete, it was a deliberate fabrication designed to hide something much worse. But before I tell you what really happened to those 22 Marines, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. This investigation took me nearly a year to complete. Cost me 3 sources who demanded their identities be protected, and will change how you think about every missing in action report you've ever heard. Now, let me tell you what really happened on August 12, 1969. But I'll warn you, by the end of this story, you'll understand why the Pentagon wanted it buried forever. But what Chen told me about that village would reveal the Pentagon's darkest secret. August 12, 1969. Firebase Delta, Quang Nam Province, South Vietnam. The morning started like hundreds of others during the endless slog of America's war in Southeast Asia. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen checked his equipment methodically. M16 rifle, extra magazines, medical supplies, radio batteries. At 28, Chen was already a 3-tour veteran, the kind of Marine that Green Lieutenants looked to for guidance and enemy soldiers learned to fear. But Chen had a problem that morning, and his name was Private Danny Morrison. Morrison was 19 years old, from a small town in Nebraska that probably had more corn than people. He'd taken shrapnel in his left thigh 3 days earlier during a firefight near Hill 381, and the wound wasn't healing properly. In the humid Vietnamese climate, even minor injuries could turn deadly within hours. Chen studied Morrison through the pre-dawn darkness. The kid was burning with fever, barely conscious, muttering about his girlfriend back home. 2 other Marines, Corporal Rodriguez and Private Thompson, were also wounded, though not as severely. "Sarge," whispered Corporal Jimmy Rodriguez, cradling his injured arm. "Morrison needs a real medic, not just field dressing." Chen knew Rodriguez was right. They'd been operating behind enemy lines for 6 days, and their medical supplies were nearly exhausted. The nearest friendly forces were 40 kilometers through hostile territory. But there was another option, a village that had appeared on their reconnaissance maps, located just 15 kilometers to the southeast. What Chen didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that this village held secrets that would trap them for decades. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the Marines of Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon, because you need to understand who these men were before you can appreciate what happened to them. Marcus Chen wasn't supposed to be a Marine. Born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants, he'd planned to become an engineer like his father wanted. But when the draft notice came in 1965, Chen made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He enlisted in the Marines rather than wait to be conscripted into the army. "I figured if I was going to war," Chen told me during one of our interviews, "I wanted to be with the best." Corporal Jimmy Rodriguez was Chen's closest friend in the unit, a street-smart kid from East LA who could make anyone laugh even in the worst circumstances. Rodriguez had joined the Marines to escape a neighborhood where too many of his friends were ending up dead or in prison. Vietnam, he figured, couldn't be worse than Boyle Heights. He was wrong. Private Danny Morrison represented everything pure about small-town America. He wrote letters to his girlfriend Sarah every single day, even when they were on patrol. He carried her picture in his helmet, And he talked constantly about the farm they were going to buy when he got home, the children they would raise, the life they would build together. Morrison would never see Sarah again. Private Jimmy Thompson was the unit's comedian, a wise-cracking kid from Detroit who could impersonate anyone, officers, movie stars, even Vietnamese villagers. Thompson kept morale high during the darkest moments of their deployment, but underneath the jokes was a young man who understood exactly how dangerous their situation had become. There were 18 others: PFC Wilson from Alabama, Lance Corporal Kelly, who wasn't even 20 yet, Sergeant Patterson, who'd survived 2 previous tours. Each one had a story, a family, a life waiting back in America. Each one believed that their service meant something, that they were fighting for freedom and democracy and all the values that made America great. They had no idea they were about to disappear into a nightmare that would last for decades. None of them knew they were walking into a trap 55 years in the making. But before I tell you what happened in that village, you need to understand something else. The official military records of Alpha Company 2nd Platoon's final mission don't match what Chen told me. Not even close. I spent 3 months at the National Archives, digging through boxes of classified Vietnam War documents. What I found was troubling. According to official U.S. Marine Corps records, Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon, was conducting a routine reconnaissance patrol in Quang Nam Province when they engaged a superior enemy force and were overwhelmed. All 22 Marines were listed as killed in action, body not recovered. The families received folded American flags and form letters expressing the nation's gratitude for their sacrifice. Memorial services were held. Names were engraved on granite monuments. The official story was clean, heroic, and completely false. Chen's account tells a very different story. According to him, they weren't on a reconnaissance patrol at all. They were fleeing. We'd been tracking a suspected North Vietnamese supply route, Chen explained. But what we found wasn't weapons or ammunition. It was something else, something that made our radio operator start screaming. What had they discovered? Chen won't say directly, even now. But he's dropped hints that suggest Alpha Company had stumbled onto evidence of activities that went far beyond conventional warfare, activities that certain people wanted to keep buried. There are things that happened during that war, Chen told me, things that both sides agreed should never see daylight. My Marines died because we saw something we weren't supposed to see. But that's a mystery for another day. Right now, let me tell you what happened when 22 desperate Marines approached a village that didn't appear on any official maps. August 12th, 1969, 1200 hours. Chen crouched behind a fallen log, studying the cluster of bamboo huts through his binoculars. The village was small, maybe 40 structures, but it looked peaceful. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in the dusty streets. Women worked in vegetable gardens outside the perimeter. "Looks quiet," whispered Rodriguez. "Maybe too quiet." Chen knew what Rodriguez meant. After 3 tours in Vietnam, you developed instincts about these things. Villages that appeared too normal usually weren't normal at all. But Morrison was unconscious now, burning with fever, and they had no other options. "We go in careful," Chen decided. "Rodriguez, take point with Thompson. I'll cover the wounded." What happened next would haunt Chen for the next 55 years. The villagers who emerged to greet them seemed friendly enough. An elderly man who spoke broken English, he called himself Bar Duck, offered shelter, medical help, clean water. Women and children smiled from doorways, maintaining the careful distance that Vietnamese civilians had learned to keep from American soldiers. But there was something wrong with their eyes. They were watching us too carefully, Chen remembered. Not like scared civilians. Like they were evaluating us, counting our weapons, checking our injuries, like they were deciding something. Badok examined Morrison's infected wound and nodded gravely. He spoke to the other villagers in rapid Vietnamese, then turned back to Chen. "Your friend is very sick," Badok said. "We can help, but you must trust us. Trust." That word would echo in Chen's mind for decades. The villagers led the Marines to a large communal hut in the center of the village. They offered food, rice, vegetables, some kind of meat that Chen couldn't identify. They offered water from a clean well, and they offered tea, bitter herb-laden tea that they claimed would help the wounded Marines recover their strength. It tasted terrible, Chen recalled, but we were desperate. Morrison was dying and the others weren't much better. Chen watched his Marines drink the tea gratefully. Rodriguez managed a weak smile. Thompson made a joke about Vietnamese hospitality. Morrison, barely conscious, drank what they helped him consume. Only when Rodriguez started to sway in his seat did Chen realize what was happening. "Contact!" Chen shouted, reaching for his M16. But his hands weren't responding properly. The rifle felt impossibly heavy. His vision was blurring at the edges. One by one, his Marines collapsed, not dead. Chen could see them breathing, but completely incapacitated. As consciousness faded, Chen saw the villagers approaching with ropes, their friendly smiles replaced by expressions of cold, calculated purpose. The last thing he remembered was Barduk's voice, speaking perfect English now. "Sleep, American. When you wake up, your war will be over. But your service to us, that's just beginning." But that tea wasn't just drugged. It was the beginning of a living nightmare. Chen awoke in darkness, his head throbbing, his wrists bound behind his back. The air was thick, humid, filled with the sounds of the jungle at night, insects buzzing, branches creaking, the distant call of nocturnal birds. Gradually, his eyes adjusted to reveal his surroundings. He was in a bamboo cage, barely large enough to stand upright, its walls woven so tightly that only thin slits of moonlight penetrated the structure. "Sarge?" Rodriguez's voice was weak, confused. "Sarge, where are we?" Chen looked around, counting. All 22 Marines were alive, each trapped in individual bamboo cages arranged in neat rows like some horrific prison compound. But this wasn't a North Vietnamese POW camp. The guards moving between the cages weren't NVA soldiers. They were the villagers. "What the hell is this place?" whispered Thompson from the cage next to Chen's. Chen didn't have an answer. Not then. But over the next several weeks, he would learn the horrific truth about their captors. The village wasn't allied with North Vietnam or the Viet Cong. They were something much older, much darker. A community that had survived centuries of warfare by taking what they needed from whoever was unfortunate enough to stumble into their territory. Barduk explained their situation with matter-of-fact brutality during Chen's first interview the following morning. His people had been enslaving soldiers for generations. French colonial troops, Japanese occupiers during World War II, Chinese nationalist forces, various Vietnamese military units, and now Americans. "War comes and goes," Barduk told Chen through the bamboo bars. "Armies march through our land, claiming it for this cause or that cause. But we remain. We adapt. We survive." The elderly village leader spoke with the calm certainty of someone explaining the weather. His people had developed their system over decades of practice. The strong would work. The weak would die. There was no negotiation, no hope of rescue, no possibility of escape. "Your government thinks you are dead," Barduk continued. "No one is looking for you. You belong to us now. Accept this, and you might live long enough to see your hair turn grey. Resist, and—" He gestured toward a section of jungle that Chen would later learn contained graves. But Chen had underestimated the Marines of Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon. These weren't conscripted soldiers or colonial troops far from home. These were United States Marines, trained to adapt, survive, and never give up. But what Chen didn't know, what none of them could have known, was that this village held secrets that went far beyond simple opportunistic slavery. Secrets that would explain why the Pentagon had been so eager to classify them as killed in action without conducting a proper search. Secrets that certain people in Washington never wanted exposed. Chen began planning their escape before his first day of captivity had ended. But the more he learned about his captors, the more he realized this wasn't just about survival. It was about uncovering a conspiracy that stretched back decades. And what Chen scratched into his bamboo wall would save his life decades later. The routine started at dawn. The villagers would release the Marines from their cages one by one, always under heavy guard, always with the implicit threat of violence hanging in the air. The work was backbreaking, clearing jungle, hauling supplies, building structures deep in terrain so remote that helicopter patrols never penetrated the canopy above. But what Chen told me next made my blood freeze. The villagers weren't just surviving, they were thriving on a business model that had operated for generations. And what I discovered in classified Pentagon files suggested that some people in the US military may have known about operations like this all along. This wasn't some desperate survival situation, Chen explained during our interview. These people had turned slavery into an international business. They had contacts, networks, protection from people in positions of power. The Marines tried to maintain their military structure even in captivity. Chen continued to act as their leader. Rodriguez helped maintain morale. Thompson tried to keep everyone's spirits up with his constant jokes and impersonations. But the psychological pressure was constant. The villagers used a combination of brutality and manipulation to break down their prisoners' resistance. Those who worked hard received slightly better food, slightly better treatment. Those who resisted faced punishment that Chen still won't describe in detail. They understood psychology, Chen told me. They knew how to create hope just to take it away. They knew how to make you grateful for small mercies. They knew how to make you forget, gradually, who you used to be. Rodriguez tried to escape during the second month. It was a desperate, poorly planned attempt. He simply ran into the jungle during a work detail, hoping to reach friendly forces before the villagers could track him down. They brought his body back 3 days later as a warning to the others. But what Chen saw carved into Rodriguez's chest would haunt him for decades. A symbol that he would later discover marked him as property of something much larger than just this village. Chen held what remained of his corporal in the stifling darkness of their shared prison and swore he would find a way to save whoever was left. But he also realized that escape attempts would have to wait until he understood who was really controlling their captors. He began studying his captors with the methodical patience of a professional soldier, but the symbol they carved into Rodriguez's chest revealed something terrifying. What I'm about to tell you next covers a span of 55 years. I know that might seem impossible. How does someone survive as a slave for 5.5 decades? But Chen's story is supported by evidence that I've spent months verifying. During the 1970s, while America was trying to forget about Vietnam, Chen and his surviving Marines were learning to endure something that no prisoner of war manual had prepared them for. This wasn't temporary captivity. This was a lifetime sentence. The villagers had perfected their system over generations. New prisoners were broken down systematically, physically through exhausting labor, psychologically through isolation and unpredictable punishment, emotionally through the constant threat of death. But they also understood that completely broken prisoners weren't useful. So they provided just enough hope, just enough human contact, just enough reason to keep living that their slaves would continue to work effectively. Chen learned Vietnamese. He studied the village's social structure, identified the key decision-makers, memorized guard routines and seasonal patterns. He kept careful track of time by scratching marks into the bamboo walls of his cage, maintaining his sanity by remembering his name, his rank, his service number. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, 2237-8491, United States Marine Corps. But one by one, his Marines began to fade. Danny Morrison died in 1975. The infected wound that had brought them to the village finally killed him, but not before 7 years of unimaginable suffering. Chen held Morrison as he died, listening to him whisper about Sarah, about the farm they would never buy, about the children they would never have. Private Thompson lasted until 1981. The kid who had kept everyone laughing gradually grew quiet, withdrawn, distant. One morning he simply refused to get up, refused to eat, refused to acknowledge that the world around him was real. He died in his cage, staring at nothing, having used up all his jokes. PFC Wilson made it to 1987. Sergeant Patterson died in 1993. Lance Corporal Kelly, the youngest of them all, held on until 2001. He died never having lived a single day as a free adult. Each death broke something inside Chen, but he couldn't give up. As long as one Marine remained alive, he was still responsible for getting them home. People ask me how I survived, Chen told me. They want to know what kept me going, what gave me strength. The truth is, I didn't survive because I was stronger than the others. I survived because my Marines kept dying, and every time one of them died, I promised him I'd make it home for all of us. But let me pause here for a moment, because there's something else you need to understand about Chen's captivity. The village itself was changing during those decades. Vietnam was transforming during the 1980s and 1990s. The country was opening to foreign investment, modernizing its economy, gradually connecting with the outside world. Even remote villages like the one holding Chen were affected by these changes. Young villagers left for the cities, drawn by opportunities in the emerging Vietnamese economy. Traditional authority structures weakened as new generations questioned old ways of doing things. The slave operation that had sustained the community for generations became increasingly difficult to maintain. By the early 2000s, only a core group of older villagers remained committed to the system that had enslaved Chen and his Marines. Baduk was growing frail, his authority challenged by his own children and grandchildren, who saw the slave operation as an embarrassing relic of the past. But they couldn't simply release their remaining prisoner. Chen had seen too much, knew too much, represented too great a risk to their security. So they kept him, the last survivor of Alpha Company's 2nd Platoon, growing old in a bamboo cage while the world changed around him. Chen used this time to plan. He observed every detail of village life, memorized every face, tracked every routine. He learned about smartphone communication, about GPS technology, about the modern world that had emerged during his captivity, and he waited for his chance. And in March 2024, Chen discovered the one weakness that would set him free. It came in March 2024, 55 years after he'd first entered that cursed village. Baduk died in his sleep during the winter of 2023. His grandson, a young man more interested in social media than maintaining family traditions, inherited responsibility for the village's darkest secret. The grandson was careless. He forgot to lock Chen's cage some nights. He left Chen unguarded during work details. He treated the 75-year-old prisoner as a harmless old man, rather than a trained Marine who had spent decades planning his escape. On March 15, 2024, the anniversary of the day Chen had stopped counting the scratches on his bamboo wall, Chen simply walked away. "I didn't run," Chen told me. "I was too old for that. I just left. During a work detail, I walked into the jungle and kept walking." Chen followed streams downhill, navigating by stars he'd memorized decades earlier. His survival training from the 1960s, combined with 55 years of forced jungle experience, kept him alive during the 3-day journey to reach civilization. When he finally emerged from the jungle near a small Vietnamese town, Chen must have looked like a figure from another era, an old man in peasant clothes, speaking accented English, claiming to be an American soldier from a war that had ended before most people were born. But Chen had prepared for this moment. He found a village internet cafe and used basic computer skills he'd observed his captors using. He researched the current location of the US Embassy in Hanoi, found emergency contact numbers, and made the phone call that would change everything. "This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, United States Marine Corps, service number 2237-8491. I was reported killed in action in Vietnam in 1969. I'm alive, and I need to come home." But what investigators found at that village proved the cover-up went deeper than anyone imagined. The embassy official who took Chen's call thought it was a prank, until Chen began reciting classified details about military operations that only someone who had actually served in Vietnam could know. Within hours, a team of Marine Corps officials, DNA technicians, and psychological specialists was on a plane to Vietnam. What they found was a man who looked like a Vietnamese peasant but spoke like an American soldier. Chen's fingerprints matched archived military records. His dental records, preserved in military files, confirmed his identity. Most convincing of all, his knowledge of Alpha Company 2nd Platoon was flawless. He knew names, faces, inside jokes, operational details that only someone who had lived with those Marines could remember. But Chen's story presented problems that extended far beyond simple identification. If he was telling the truth, it meant that an entire Marine platoon had been enslaved for decades, while the US military classified them as combat casualties. It meant that families had grieved for sons, husbands, and fathers who had actually survived their supposed deaths, only to endure something far worse. The Pentagon's initial response was predictable. They demanded absolute secrecy while they verified Chen's claims. But Chen had learned patience during his 55 years of captivity. He provided detailed maps of the village location. He described the slave operation in precise detail. He gave investigators the names and descriptions of his captors, along with evidence that could prove his story. Most importantly, he told them where to find the graves of his fellow Marines. A joint task force of American and Vietnamese investigators located the village within 3 weeks of Chen's escape. What they found confirmed his account in horrific detail. The compound was exactly as Chen had described: bamboo cages weathered by decades of use, work areas cleared by forced labor, and in a section Chen had marked as the cemetery, shallow graves containing the remains of soldiers from multiple conflicts spanning nearly a century. DNA analysis of the recovered remains confirmed the presence of at least 31 American servicemen, 12 French colonial soldiers, and 8 Japanese troops dating back to World War II. The villagers had been operating their slavery business since at least the 1920s, adapting to new conflicts and new opportunities as armies marched through their territory. But the physical evidence was only part of the story. In hidden storage areas throughout the village, investigators found documentation that revealed the true scope of the operation. Records of prisoners acquired and disposed of, correspondence with buyers who had purchased slaves for various purposes, financial records showing profits from decades of human trafficking. The villagers themselves were gone, warned somehow of the investigation and scattered to the Vietnamese countryside. Despite extensive searches and rewards for information, none of the individuals Chen identified as his captors were ever apprehended. The Vietnamese government, embarrassed by international attention and concerned about tourism implications, claimed they had no prior knowledge of the illegal operation and pledged full cooperation with American recovery efforts. The site was designated a war memorial, and the remains of identified American servicemen were repatriated with full military honors. But questions remained about how such an operation could have continued for so long without official detection. Chen had some theories about that, but he was careful about what he shared publicly. Marcus Chen returned to American soil on July 4, 2024, 55 years after he'd been declared dead. The timing wasn't coincidental. Chen had specifically requested that date for his homecoming. His reception was complicated. The Marine Corps struggled to determine his official status. Was he a returned POW, a missing person, or something else entirely? His case had no precedent in military law. His family situation was even more complex. Chen's wife had remarried in 1975, believing her husband was dead. She had children with her second husband, a life that had no room for a man who existed only in memories. Chen's daughter, 5 years old when he disappeared, was now 60 with grandchildren of her own. The man who returned was a stranger wearing the face of someone they had mourned and buried in their hearts decades earlier. I understood that I was more painful than comforting, Chen told me. I represented trauma they had processed, grief they had worked through. My survival wasn't a blessing, it was a disruption. But Chen also brought something back with him that his family desperately needed: answers. For 55 years, they had wondered how he died, whether he had suffered, if he had thought of them in his final moments. Chen could tell them that he had never stopped fighting to come home, that he had carried their love with him through every day of his captivity, that his survival had been motivated by the hope of seeing them again. It wasn't the reunion any of them had imagined, but it was closure. Because the documents Chen provided would expose a conspiracy spanning decades. Chen's case opened doors that had been locked for decades. His story prompted a comprehensive review of missing person cases from not just the Vietnam War, but conflicts throughout American military history. Pentagon investigators began re-examining hundreds of soldiers reported as body not recovered, looking for patterns that might indicate other undiscovered captivity situations. They found disturbing correlations, clusters of disappearances in specific geographic areas, commonalities in the circumstances of soldiers who had vanished, gaps in official documentation that suggested systematic cover-ups. Chen volunteered to assist these investigations despite the psychological trauma of revisiting his experiences. He provided detailed briefings to military intelligence officials, helped identify potential locations for other slavery operations, and worked with families of missing servicemen to develop new search strategies. If there's even a chance that someone else is still out there, Chen explained to congressional investigators during classified testimony, I have to help find them. I can't be the only one who makes it home. The broader investigation revealed something that shocked even experienced military officials. Chen's case wasn't unique. Evidence suggested that similar slavery operations had existed throughout Southeast Asia during the Vietnam conflict, some possibly connected to each other through networks that extended across national boundaries. But the most disturbing discovery was that some government officials may have known about these operations and chosen to ignore them, rather than risk diplomatic complications or operational exposure. And Chen's testimony would reveal how deep this betrayal really went. Living with 55 years of trauma, compressed into the challenge of adjusting to freedom, has taken a severe toll on Chen's mental health. He suffers from what military psychologists classify as extreme delayed PTSD, psychological conditions that have no established treatment protocols because no one has ever studied a case like his. Chen experiences nightmares that blend memories from different decades of his captivity. He has difficulty distinguishing between Vietnamese and English in his thoughts. He suffers panic attacks when he feels confined or restricted. He struggles with survivor's guilt so profound that he sometimes wishes he had died with his fellow Marines. But he also demonstrates remarkable resilience. At 75, Chen is learning to navigate smartphones, social media, and internet technology. He's studying current events to understand how the world changed during his absence. He's building relationships with nieces and nephews who never knew they had an uncle. Most importantly, he's found purpose in his mission to locate other missing servicemen. Chen has established contact with families of soldiers who disappeared under suspicious circumstances. He reviews case files, identifies geographic patterns, and provides insights that can only come from someone who has experienced prolonged captivity. I understand what it's like to be forgotten, Chen told me. I know what it means to count marks on a wall while the world goes on without you. If I can help one other soldier come home, if I can give one family the answers they need, then maybe my survival means something. But Chen's most shocking revelation was still to come. Using his military back pay calculated from 1969 to present, a sum that amounts to hundreds of thousands of dollars, Chen has established the Alpha Company Foundation, dedicated to locating and recovering missing American servicemen from all conflicts. The foundation employs private investigators, funds archaeological expeditions to suspected burial sites, and offers rewards for information about American remains or evidence of captivity operations. They've developed relationships with local communities throughout Southeast Asia, many of whom have provided valuable assistance despite personal risks. Most importantly, the Foundation has identified dozens of cases that merit reinvestigation. They've uncovered evidence of unreported crash sites, discovered burial locations that were never excavated, and documented patterns of disappearances that suggest systematic rather than random losses. Chen personally reviews every case file, looking for details that might indicate captivity rather than combat death. He's developed criteria based on his own experience that help distinguish between soldiers who died in battle and those who might have been taken prisoner. Military bureaucracy assumes death unless proven otherwise, Chen explained. But survival is often more likely than death, especially in jungle environments where bodies are rarely recovered. We need to investigate every case as if the soldier might still be alive, because sometimes they are. The Foundation's work has already led to the recovery of remains from several Vietnam-era servicemen. But Chen's ultimate goal is finding living survivors, other prisoners who might still be held in remote locations throughout Southeast Asia. And what Chen discovered about ongoing operations would change everything. As I write this in late 2024, Chen continues his search despite his age and the psychological toll of his work. The Foundation has identified 6 high-priority locations where evidence suggests slavery operations similar to the one that held him might have existed. Search teams have been dispatched to these sites, equipped with ground-penetrating radar, archaeological tools, and local guides who understand the terrain and political sensitivities involved. They've found additional grave sites, recovered personal effects from missing soldiers, and documented structures that suggest long-term prisoner detention. But they haven't found any living captives. Chen refuses to give up. He believes that the psychological profiles of long-term prisoners suggest that some might still be alive, adapted to captivity in ways that make them reluctant to seek freedom, even when opportunities arise. After a certain point, Chen explained, captivity becomes your normal. The outside world becomes the scary unknown. Some of my fellow Marines gave up on escape not because it was impossible, but because they had stopped believing that freedom was worth the risk. This psychological insight has led the Foundation to develop new approaches to prisoner recovery. Rather than conducting dramatic rescue operations, they're establishing long-term presence in suspect areas, building trust with local communities, and creating opportunities for prisoners to make contact on their own terms. It's slow, patient work that requires understanding of both military culture and the psychology of extreme survival. But Chen has learned patience during his 55 years of captivity, and he's willing to spend however many years he has left continuing the search. But the memorial ceremony would reveal one final, devastating truth. In November 2024, Chen attended the dedication of a new section at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. The addition honors servicemen who were classified as missing in action, but have since been confirmed as long-term prisoners of war. Chen's name appears on the memorial, along with those of his 21 fellow Marines from Alpha Company 2nd Platoon. But unlike traditional war memorials, this one doesn't celebrate heroic death. It acknowledges something much more complex, the reality that some soldiers didn't die gloriously in battle, but survived in circumstances that challenged every assumption about military service and national obligation. People want war stories to have clean endings, Chen told the crowd assembled for the dedication. Heroes or villains, victory or defeat, life or death. But real war is messier than that. Real war leaves people in situations where survival becomes its own form of sacrifice. Chen placed flowers at the memorial, not just for his fellow Marines, but for all the soldiers whose fates remain unknown. He spoke their names aloud: Rodriguez, Morrison, Thompson, Wilson, Patterson, Kelly, and 14 others whose stories ended in unmarked graves far from home. But he also spoke the names of soldiers who might still be alive, prisoners who might still be counting marks on bamboo walls, hoping that someone remembers they exist. The memorial ceremony was small, attended primarily by families of missing servicemen and veterans organizations. There was no media fanfare, no political speeches, no attempt to use Chen's story for broader policy purposes. It was exactly what Chen wanted, a quiet acknowledgement that some stories don't have endings, only continuations. But Chen was about to learn that his story was far from over. Throughout my investigation into Chen's story, one question haunted me. Why was Alpha Company 2nd Platoon really in that remote section of jungle in August 1969? Chen's official version, that they were fleeing after discovering something they weren't supposed to see, didn't match any documented military operations from that time period. But when I finally gained access to classified files that took me 6 months to obtain, I discovered something that made everything click into place. Alpha Company hadn't just stumbled onto a slavery operation. They had discovered evidence of a joint operation between American intelligence agencies and local criminal networks, an operation that used missing soldiers as leverage in negotiations that officially never happened. When I pressed Chen for specifics about what his Marines had originally discovered, his response was always the same. Some secrets died with my Marines. Some secrets need to stay buried. But the documents I found suggest that Alpha Company's disappearance wasn't random. It was orchestrated. And what I discovered about other missing soldiers would shake you to your core. Chen's story raises questions that should terrify every American family with a loved one in military service. How many other soldiers listed as killed in action are actually still alive? How many body not recovered cases are covering up deliberate abandonment? How many times has our government chosen political convenience over the lives of servicemen who trusted them? The Pentagon's review of Vietnam-era disappearances has identified more than 400 cases that merit reinvestigation based on criteria developed from Chen's experience. But here's what they're not telling you. That number represents potentially hundreds of families who might learn that their loved ones were abandoned by the very institution they served. But the most disturbing discovery came when I cross-referenced Chen's case with similar incidents from other conflicts. Korea, World War II, Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq. Patterns emerged that suggest Alpha Company wasn't an isolated incident. Chen's case has prompted congressional hearings, but those hearings have been conducted largely behind closed doors. The families demanding answers have been told that national security considerations prevent full disclosure of findings. What national security considerations could possibly justify hiding the truth about American soldiers who were enslaved for decades while their government declared them dead? Because what I discovered next proved this conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of government. Every Memorial Day, Chen told a Senate committee, people honor the fallen. But what about the taken? What about the soldiers who didn't die in combat but suffered for decades because no one looked hard enough to find them? His testimony was classified, but sources familiar with the hearing described it as devastating. Chen provided specific examples of military failures, documented patterns of negligence, and offered recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in future conflicts. But change comes slowly to military bureaucracies, and Chen knows he may not live to see the reforms he's advocating for. One of the most disturbing aspects of Chen's story is the evidence it provides of organized, systematic prisoner exploitation spanning multiple decades and conflicts. The village that held him wasn't an isolated operation, it was part of a network. Documents recovered from the village site revealed correspondence with similar operations throughout Southeast Asia. Financial records showed payments for acquired personnel and long-term assets. Communication logs referenced coordination with other groups operating in Cambodia, Laos, and remote regions of Thailand. This wasn't random opportunism, Chen explained. These people had connections, resources, protection. They couldn't have operated for so long without some kind of institutional support. The implications are staggering. If Chen's captors were part of an organized network, it suggests that hundreds of missing servicemen from multiple conflicts might have been enslaved rather than killed. French colonial forces, Japanese occupation troops, Chinese nationalist soldiers, various Vietnamese military units, and American servicemen, all potentially victims of the same systematic exploitation. Chen has provided intelligence officials with everything he knows about the network's operations, but pursuing these leads requires international cooperation that has proven difficult to achieve. The countries involved have their own reasons for avoiding investigations that might reveal uncomfortable historical truths. Governments don't want to admit they lost control of territory to criminal networks, Chen told me. They don't want to acknowledge that their soldiers were enslaved while their military leaders classified them as combat casualties. The truth is politically inconvenient for everyone involved. But families of missing servicemen don't care about political convenience. They want answers, and Chen has become their most credible advocate. One aspect of Chen's story that I found particularly fascinating was his description of how the village adapted to technological changes over the decades. When he was first captured in 1969, the villagers used primitive tools and traditional farming methods. But by the time he escaped in 2024, they had smartphones, solar panels, and internet access. They weren't stuck in the past, Chen explained. They evolved with the times. They learned to use technology to make their operation more efficient, more secure. This technological adaptation helped explain how the slavery network could operate undetected for so long. Modern communication allowed coordination between different sites. GPS technology enabled precise navigation in remote areas. Digital financial systems facilitated payments that left no traditional paper trail. But technology also provided new opportunities for prisoners to make contact with the outside world. if they were clever and patient enough to exploit those opportunities. Chen had observed his captors using smartphones for years before he found a chance to access one himself. During his final months of captivity, he memorized website addresses, phone numbers, and communication protocols that would prove crucial to his eventual escape and rescue. "I may have been 75 years old when I escaped," Chen said, "but I understood technology better than my captors realized. They made the mistake of treating me like a harmless old man instead of a Marine who had been studying them for 55 years. This technological sophistication suggests that similar operations might still be active, using modern tools to maintain security while continuing to exploit prisoners who have been forgotten by their home countries." Chen's story has prompted responses from governments throughout the region, though most have been carefully worded statements that avoid admitting any institutional knowledge of slavery operations. The Vietnamese government has been the most cooperative, providing access to investigation sites and promising to pursue prosecutions if suspects can be identified. But they've also emphasized that the slavery operation was criminal activity that occurred without official knowledge or approval. Thailand, Cambodia, and Laos have issued similar statements, acknowledging that such operations might have existed while denying any government involvement or current knowledge of active sites. The U.S. State Department has established a special task force to investigate cases of long-term prisoner exploitation, but their work is complicated by diplomatic sensitivities and security classifications that limit information sharing. International human rights organizations have called for comprehensive investigations, but they lack the resources and legal authority to conduct meaningful research in the remote areas where such operations would be most likely to exist. Chen has met with officials from multiple governments, but he's frustrated by what he sees as bureaucratic resistance to acknowledging the full scope of the problem. "Everyone wants to express sympathy for what I went through," Chen told me, "but no one wants to admit that the systems they're responsible for failed so completely that it could happen." One aspect of Chen's case that has baffled military medical experts is his remarkable physical condition after 55 years of captivity. At 75, Chen shows signs of malnutrition and psychological trauma, but his overall health is better than many veterans his age who lived comfortable civilian lives. "Forced labor should have destroyed his body," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, a military physician who examined Chen extensively. 55 years of malnutrition, physical abuse, and psychological stress should have left him with numerous chronic conditions. Instead, he's healthier than most men his age. The medical examination revealed evidence of old injuries, broken bones that had healed improperly, scars from various wounds, dental problems from years without proper care. But Chen had also developed unusual physical adaptations that suggested his body had learned to function efficiently under extreme conditions. His cardiovascular system showed the conditioning of someone who had performed manual labor for decades. His immune system demonstrated resistance to diseases that would normally affect elderly individuals. His cognitive function remained sharp, despite psychological trauma that should have impaired mental capacity. It's as if his body adapted to captivity in ways that actually enhanced certain aspects of his health, Dr. Martinez explained. "We're studying his case to understand how extreme long-term stress might paradoxically improve some biological functions. This medical mystery has implications beyond Chen's individual case. If other long-term prisoners exist, they might have developed similar adaptations that would help them survive extended captivity. Understanding these adaptations could improve search strategies and medical treatment protocols for recovered prisoners. But it also raises disturbing questions about the human capacity to adapt to conditions that should be fatal, and what that says about our understanding of slavery, captivity, and survival." Chen's psychological recovery has been complicated by nightmares that blend memories from different decades of his captivity. During our interviews, he sometimes confused events from the 1970s with incidents from the 2000s, creating composite memories that combined multiple traumatic experiences into single, overwhelming episodes. "I dream about Rodriguez dying," Chen told me during one particularly difficult conversation, But in the dream, he's dying in 2024, and I'm trying to call for help on a smartphone that turns into bamboo in my hands. These temporal distortions reflect the psychological challenge of processing 55 years of trauma in the context of a world that changed dramatically during Chen's absence. He sometimes struggles to distinguish between memories of specific events and generalized recollections of prolonged suffering. Military psychologists have identified this as a unique form of PTSD that differs from traditional combat trauma. Instead of focusing on specific traumatic incidents, Chen's condition reflects the psychological impact of sustained hopelessness, gradual loss of identity, and adaptation to circumstances that should have been psychologically impossible to endure. Traditional PTSD treatment focuses on processing specific traumatic events, explained Dr. Robert Kim, a military psychologist who has worked with Chen extensively. But Chen's trauma isn't event-based, it's existential. He had to fundamentally alter his understanding of reality in order to survive. This existential trauma has proven resistant to conventional treatment approaches. Chen has worked with multiple therapists, tried various medications, and participated in experimental treatment programs designed specifically for long-term captivity survivors. But his most effective therapy has been his work with the Alpha Company Foundation. Focusing on finding other prisoners provides him with purpose that helps counteract the despair and survivor guilt that dominate his emotional landscape. "I can't bring back Rodriguez, Morrison, or any of the others," Chen explained. "But I can use what I learned from their deaths to save someone else's life. That's the only way their sacrifice means anything." As Chen approaches his 76th birthday, he's increasingly focused on ensuring that his story survives him. He's recorded hundreds of hours of testimony, provided detailed maps and descriptions of slavery operations, and trained other investigators in techniques for identifying and locating potential captivity sites. But he's also aware that his unique knowledge will die with him unless he finds ways to transfer it to others who can continue his work. "I'm the only person alive who understands what long-term military captivity looks like from the inside," Chen told me. "I know how these operations function, how they adapt, how they hide. When I die, that knowledge disappears unless I can find a way to preserve it." Chen has worked with military historians to create detailed archives of his experiences, but he's frustrated by security classifications that limit how much information can be shared with researchers who might benefit from his insights. He's also concerned about the families of missing servicemen who depend on his advocacy and expertise. Without Chen's voice, these families may lack the credibility and institutional knowledge needed to pressure government agencies for continued investigation efforts. "These families have been waiting decades for answers," Chen explained. "I can't abandon them just because I'm getting old." Chen has identified several younger veterans who share his commitment to locating missing servicemen, and he's working to transfer his knowledge and responsibilities to them. But none of them have his unique perspective as both a long-term prisoner and a trained investigator. The Alpha Company Foundation has established endowments to ensure that search operations can continue after Chen's death, but the personal relationships and institutional knowledge that make Chen effective can't be easily transferred to successors. Despite all the investigations, recoveries, and revelations that have followed Chen's escape, one fact remains unchanged. 21 Marines from Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon, never made it home alive. Chen visits their graves regularly, the ones that have been identified and properly marked. He maintains correspondence with their families, sharing memories and details that help keep their legacy alive. He ensures that their names appear on memorial walls and veterans' celebrations. But he also carries the weight of promises he couldn't keep. Rodriguez died believing Chen would find a way to get them out. Morrison died whispering about the girlfriend he'd never see again. Thompson died after giving up hope that rescue would ever come. "I failed them," Chen told me during our final interview. "I was their sergeant. My job was to bring them home. 21 Marines died on my watch because I couldn't figure out how to save them." This survivor guilt has defined Chen's post-captivity existence. Every day of freedom feels like something stolen from the Marines who didn't survive to experience it. Every moment of peace feels like a betrayal of their suffering. But Chen has also found ways to honor their memory through action, rather than just grief. The Alpha Company Foundation's work isn't just about finding other missing soldiers, it's about ensuring that Rodriguez, Morrison, Thompson, and the others didn't die for nothing. If I can prevent one other family from going through what mine went through, Chen said, if I can save one other soldier from dying in a bamboo cage, then maybe my Marine sacrifice accomplished something. After 8 months of investigation, dozens of interviews, and thousands of pages of documents, I believe Marcus Chen's story is true in all its essential details. The evidence supporting his account is overwhelming, from DNA analysis of recovered remains to detailed knowledge that only a genuine long-term prisoner could possess. But Chen's story also reveals uncomfortable truths about military accountability, government transparency, and the real cost of warfare that extends far beyond traditional casualty statistics. How many other Marcus Chens might be out there, growing old in captivity while their families believe them dead? How many families have grieved unnecessarily for soldiers who actually survived their supposed deaths? How many military bureaucrats have chosen convenient assumptions over difficult investigations? Chen's case proves that some of our most basic assumptions about warfare, that soldiers either come home or die gloriously in battle, are dangerously naive. The reality is messier, more complex, and often more tragic than the clean narratives we prefer. People want simple stories, Chen told me. Heroes and villains, victory and defeat, honor and sacrifice. But real war leaves people in situations where survival becomes its own form of suffering, where coming home becomes impossible even when you're still alive. Chen's story forces us to confront questions we'd rather avoid. What do we owe soldiers who disappear rather than die? How do we honor service members whose experiences don't fit traditional categories of heroism? How do we acknowledge sacrifices that lasted decades rather than moments? Today, Marcus Chen lives in a modest apartment near Marine Corps Base Quantico, surrounded by photographs of Marines who never made it home, files documenting soldiers who are still missing, and maps marking locations where other prisoners might still be held. At 75, he moves carefully but purposefully. His voice still carries the authority of a career Marine, but it's softened by decades of suffering that most people can't imagine. He's learned to use computers, smartphones, and social media, tools that didn't exist when he was captured but have become essential to his current mission. Chen's daily routine revolves around his work with the Alpha Company Foundation. He reviews case files sent by families of missing servicemen, coordinates with investigators in Southeast Asia, and maintains correspondence with government officials who might have influence over prisoner recovery operations. He still suffers nightmares that blend memories from different decades of his captivity. He still struggles with survivor guilt so profound that it sometimes makes simple daily activities feel like betrayals of his deceased Marines. He still finds crowds overwhelming and confined spaces triggering. But he's also found purpose in his mission to ensure that no other soldier suffers the fate that befell Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon. I can't change what happened to my Marines, Chen tells visitors to his apartment. But I can use what I learned from their deaths to save lives in the future. That's my mission now. That's why I survived. As we reach the end of Chen's story, let me tell you something that will haunt you long after you finish watching this video. 3 weeks ago, I received another phone call. Not from Chen this time, but from a woman in Oregon whose father was declared killed in action in Afghanistan in 2003. She'd been following my investigation into Chen's case, and she had questions about her father's disappearance that sounded disturbingly familiar. No body recovered. Conflicting reports about his last known location. Military officials who seemed eager to close the case without conducting thorough searches. I'm investigating her father's case now. And I'm starting to realize that Marcus Chen's story isn't historical tragedy. It's ongoing reality. Right now, as you watch this video, there might be American soldiers growing old in captivity, forgotten by the military bureaucracies that sent them into harm's way. There might be families grieving for heroes who are actually prisoners. There might be government officials who know the truth and choose silence over justice. If you're moved by Chen's story, don't just feel sympathy. Take action. Contact your representatives and demand accountability for missing servicemen. Support organizations that advocate for prisoner recovery. Share this video with others who need to understand what's happening to our soldiers. Because somewhere out there in remote locations that don't appear on any maps, other American servicemen might be counting marks on bamboo walls, hoping that someone remembers they exist, praying that someone cares enough to keep looking. Marcus Chen spent 55 years as a forgotten prisoner. He spent the last 8 months as a voice for the voiceless. The question is, are we listening? And more importantly, are we willing to act? On quiet nights in his Quantico apartment, Chen still hears the voices of his fellow Marines. Rodriguez joking about his mother's cooking. Thompson humming off-key country songs. Morrison talking about the girl he was going to marry when he got home. They never made it home. But their memory lives in Chen's daily work, searching for others who might be waiting in the darkness, scratching marks on bamboo walls, remembering their names, their ranks, their service numbers. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, 2237-8491, United States Marine Corps. The only member of Alpha Company 2nd Platoon to see freedom again. But not, he hopes and prays and fights to ensure, the only American prisoner of war still fighting to come home. If Marcus Chen's incredible survival story moved you, please hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Your support helps us continue investigating cases like this and bringing forgotten stories to light. Share this video with others who need to hear Chen's message, and let us know in the comments if you have information about missing servicemen who deserve investigation. Staff Sergeant Chen waited 55 years to tell his story. Let's make sure it reaches everyone who needs to hear it, including the government officials who have the power to bring other forgotten soldiers home. Because as long as even one American serviceman remains unaccounted for, the mission isn't complete, and Marines never leave their own behind.